Hi, I'm Steve Suranovic. I'm in the economics department at George Washington University, and I've been teaching large section introductory microeconomics courses for more than 10 years. In that time, I've developed a new approach that I want to share with you. This approach will enable students to learn all of the traditional economics models, but will provide a new perspective that will give them a better understanding of what motivates the ideological differences between the right and the left. Using this moderate perspective, I hope economics will be more inclusive to students of all backgrounds and will help dispel some of the more radical positions that many in our society are gravitating towards. You might ask, why is this needed? Well, recently, and especially with social media, there's been a tendency to polarize discussion of issues. Ideas are either right or wrong, smart or stupid, etc. This tendency is problematic because it promotes the formation of opposition groups. People think you're either on my side or you're on their side. You're either with me or against me. And this, I think, prevents deeper, more nuanced inquiry that can enable a better understanding of the rationales behind different positions. Consider an example taken from the headlines in the aftermath of the Business Roundtable's 2019 announcement to revise its stated purpose of a corporation, which, since the 1970s, had upheld Milton Friedman's position that the sole purpose of the corporation is to increase shareholder value. Now, some of the headlines discuss the decision by first condemning Friedman. First, consider Milton Friedman was wrong. Next, the origin of, quote, the world's dumbest idea, unquote. Or 50 years later, Milton Friedman's shareholder doctrine is dead. Now, other articles profess the opposite view. Consider these. Stop blaming Milton Friedman. Or Milton Friedman was right about shareholder capitalism. Or finally, the enduring wisdom of Milton Friedman. Now, to a young student new to this controversy, it may seem as though either Friedman was correct and wise, or he was dead wrong and stupid. This may lead to the tendency to either laud Friedman's view and accept everything else that he ever said, or to reject his view and condemn everything else he ever said. In other words, increasing polarization and a tendency towards conflict rather than a fuller or deeper understanding. Also consider the recent tendency amongst young people to embrace socialism and to almost revile capitalism. Consider these recent US headlines. First, this era's capitalism is driving many among the young to socialism. Or the evils of capitalism. Social media divides people more than it unites them. Or finally, anti-capitalism on US university campuses. The culture war is fought dirty. These same criticisms of capitalism have also been directed at the economics discipline, which has been perhaps the foremost supporter of capitalism, whether in its unfettered free market version or in its democratic socialist version. Many students, though, have complained that the economics approach is disconnected from the realities of the world and has become increasingly irrelevant. In fact, about 10 years ago, Harvard students staged a walkout of Gregory Mankiw's Mainstream Principles course to protest the content of the course. Now, I don't share these views, but I do accept that the traditional approach to teaching principles of economics is defective and needs a reorientation. The traditional approach to teaching economics is really based on Paul Samuelson's scientific mathematical approach, merging models and data in order to develop and derive a neoclassical model and its subsequent variations. Now, this is a valuable approach and has considerable merit. But in the process of becoming more scientific, it's also de-emphasized the moral or ethical features of human behavior. And it seems to treat economic agents as cold, calculating utility and profit maximizing. One alternative is to abandon traditional neoclassical theories in favor of new models. For example, the Samuel Bowles Wendy Carlin Core Project at Oxford University is promoting a new principles textbook that jettisons the traditional neoclassical models. And they focus more on issues such as inequality. Now, I think this can work, but the adjustment cost for instructors is relatively high, and I would argue it's not absolutely necessary. An alternative is to preserve the traditional economic models, but to reintroduce a critical missing feature, namely ethics, which can then lead to a completely new understanding. I'll explain the features of this new course in a minute, but first let me show you some of the impacts on students. I've been teaching this course to my GW class for quite a while now. And recently, in a survey of over 230 GW students who were exposed to this new approach, 87% agreed that self-interest must be constrained by ethical behavior to assure good economic outcomes. 69% of students believed the course made them believe more so that free markets are mostly a positive force in the economy. 74% of the students believed that the course helped them to clarify their own economic and political views. And then lastly, and I think the most important outcome, is 88% of the students agreed that the course designed helped them to better understand the opinions of other people that they disagreed with. Next, let me highlight some of the features of this new approach. First, this new approach demonstrates that the self-interest motivation of economic agents must be constrained in order to generate economically efficient outcomes. Now, these constraints on behavior typically correspond to ethical behavior. For example, a respect for property rights implies a prohibition of theft. There's also an assumed prohibition of fraud and deception. There's an assumption about freedom to compete, free entry and exit of firms, free flow of technological information, and also good neighborliness, to name just a few. And this one is a restraint with respect to negative externalities. Now, these behaviors have been implicitly incorporated in neoclassical models, but economists have for too long downplayed their importance. When these features are highlighted, it becomes possible to show that when agents act unethically, not only does it contribute to economic inefficiencies, it also contributes to economic injustices and rising inequality. Traditional economic models, I think, work just fine when these normative aspects of human behavior are considered and included along the way. However, it's also important to emphasize the appropriate way to interpret economic models. Economic models should not be viewed as literal representations of the real world. Instead, models are simplifications that don't perfectly mimic the real world outcome, but do incorporate important features of the real world. It's through playing with models that it helps us to understand which features or which assumptions are critical to produce certain results. In the approach that I take, I've reorganized the models are presented. And the first economic model presented in the course is the pure exchange model using an Edgeworth box. Now, this is used to demonstrate the mutually beneficial gains from trade, but it's also used, and this is perhaps more important, to consider alternatives to mutually beneficial trade. And that includes things such as theft and deception. In order to understand why ethical behavior is important, it's also important to demonstrate how the outcomes of the models will change when unethical behavior is allowed. The second feature of the model, the second model presented, is the Edgeworth box with production included in order to demonstrate comparative advantage and how profit-motivated agents will actually lead to more efficient outcomes. This is an important element that contributes to the belief in freer markets. Next, we then talk more generally about market demand and develop the theory of the consumer and the developed market demand curve. Next, we talk about the theory of production, followed next by the theory of monopoly and how a monopoly would operate in a market. Next, we build up and say, what if instead of one firm, there's two firms that operate and compete against each other? By talking about this stepwise fashion, we can then begin to develop the impact or effect of rising competition, finishing it off with the perfect competition model, and then the development of the final supply and demand curve, which actually only occurs about midway through the course. Now, by building up the stepwise fashion, it develops a way of introducing or discussing the effects of rising competition. And once we get to the perfect competition result, we can then backtrack and talk about methods that firms use to actually reduce competition and why this can increase inequality. We talk, for example, about issues like product differentiation, mergers, non-compete clauses, professional licensing, intellectual property rights, tariffs, government regulations, etc., etc. The second half of the course focuses attention on the effects of government policy. Now, this is shown to be mostly unnecessary in terms of economic efficiency if we're in the realm of perfect competition. But it's potentially efficiency improving in the presence of market imperfections, also known as market failures. Now, the market imperfections evaluated in this course include externalities like pollution, public goods, common resources, monopsonistic labor markets, imperfect information, the potential for theft, and also political economy problems. We compare governmental versus private institutions that have arisen or developed in order to correct for many of these problems. Finally, and what I think is a really critically important element of the course, is to introduce the logic of collective action. This provides the potential for government failure in a democracy. Next, we demonstrate the logic of economic ideologies on both the left and the right. Those on the left tend to worry more about market failures and suggest that these can be corrected with government intervention. I think that's true, they can be corrected, but only if information is perfect and government decisions are socially directed. On the other hand, those on the traditional right tend to worry more about government failure. They tend to suggest that private markets can correct market failure if left alone. This too, I think, is true. They can be corrected this way, but again, only if information is perfect and if economic agents act ethically. Now, neither of these positions dominates the other. Both of them, I think, have merit, but they both also have serious deficiencies too. The key emphasis of this approach is a demonstration of the strengths and weaknesses of the economic arguments on both the right and the left, to show that there are both market failures and government failures, to show that there are both government solutions and private solutions to many of the highlighted problems, and also to show that neither position clearly dominates the other. If we don't teach that economic models are imperfect representations of the world, then the discipline is defenseless when economic advice seems to fail. If we don't teach students why ethical behavior matters, then we shouldn't be surprised if they think, for example, that anything goes when it comes to business. Lying, cheating, stealing, all of this is okay to make money because it's the way to satisfy self-interest. We shouldn't be surprised if students believe that police are unnecessary, if we haven't talked about the role of police and the problems associated with theft and private property. We shouldn't be surprised if students think that capitalism is defunct and socialism is the future. If you're interested in learning more about this approach in this course, I encourage you to visit my website at ethicalecon.org. It contains primers on the ethical behaviors that are important for economic success, but it also contains a full microeconomics principles course, including lecture notes, PowerPoint slides, video presentations, and related readings. Soon, it will include practice problems for students to learn the material more deeply. Please consider incorporating some of this material into your current microeconomics course. And if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you.